I'm not going to do a warm, well, I am going to do a warm welcome, but a very short warm welcome, because Andrew will do a more of a warm welcome later on when we have something nice to drink. But what I am going to do is just say a very few words about our speaker this evening. When I was this afternoon, about 15 minutes before I came out of the house, trying to think about what on earth I should say to introduce Anthony, my first thought was, well, actually as little as possible, since you haven't come here to hear me, you've come here to hear him. And then my next thought was, well, how long have I known Anthony? And I was a little bit taken aback, because when I thought about it, I realized it wasn't far short of 40 years.
I think it might be. Yeah.
Could well be.
Yeah.
I first came across Anthony, certainly, when he was involved in setting up and leading the 1983 British election survey. And of course, elections, polling, and social attitudes has been one of the things that Anthony has pursued throughout a very large proportion of his career. And of course, it's a very long Nuffield tradition. In fact, going back to 1945, the first study of elections, the first in the Nuffield series of British election studies by Ronald Buchanan McCallum, not someone who I was terribly familiar with, I must say, but looking at the introduction to the volume, it told me that he was in fact a faculty fellow of Nuffield, though his Wikipedia page actually says that he was more well known as a fellow of Pembroke and later master of Pembroke, but we shall forgive him that. And in that book, the appendix to it was provided by none other than David Butler, another fellow of the college, someone who is kind of known as the father of polling and psephology, certainly in the United Kingdom. Which leads me very nicely into the third thing that I thought, which was that when I was talking to Caroline earlier in the week, she reminded me that Anthony had recently been awarded the David Butler Prize of the Political Studies Association for his lifetime contribution to the study of elections, public opinions, and parties. So congratulations, Anthony.
Thank you.
At which point I should stop.
Yep.
and let Anthony take over, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As Colin knows, I tend to become somewhat more talkative as I've got older, and you will stop me at a suitable time, won't you, Colin? Even in mid-flow, because I'm going to basically just reminisce about some of the work I've done with various government bodies. And reminiscing, of course, is a bit of a trap, because you can go on and on. So, I'm going to focus on the relationship between sociological research, particularly, I'm afraid, mine and that of my students and colleagues, and policy making. And I'm going to reminisce about my various forays into policy research, how I got involved, and speculating about whether the forays made any difference. Going back to the title, after I'd written the talk this morning, I thought, that's a rather over-optimistic title. I think it should be many failures, but the occasional near miss. So I'm afraid that's as good as it gets. Okay. So, but what we're doing is very much within the spirit of the college charter. Here it is, where we are especially required to cooperate, study by cooperation between academic and non-academic persons of social, including economic and political problems. And that is indeed what I've been doing over the last 40 years, possibly even longer, although most of my examples actually do come from the last 40 years. Yeah, so I won't digress on to the earlier ones. And that's a rather different approach from the one we find in the ESRC and REF. Actually, you also find it in government. And I apologize to Alison in advance for taking the ESRC's name in vain. But the reason I've quoted the ESRC rather than the REF or ONS is that I could find it on the website. So that's a tribute to the ESRC. So, and this is the definition for research impact, which whenever we write a grant application, we have to show our pathway to impact. So we've got to demonstrate the contribution that our excellent research makes to society and the economy. And I particularly highlighted this aspect, the economic and societal impact, which is a demonstrable contribution that excellent social and economic research has on society and the economy and its benefits to individuals, organizations, or nations. And there are two very different approaches. So the ESRC and the REF and the somewhat similar things I've come across with ONS, emphasizing a causal narrative in which our excellent research influences development of policy and practice. And yeah, so a world, as I've said here, a Panglossian world, not that I've ever read Candide, but Dr. Pangloss was a famous optimist and a bit of a pedant. So a world of benevolent technocrats. And most of my talk is going to be saying, well, actually, I don't think we're all benevolent technocrats. Whereas the college just says, please get on and collaborate. And actually, most of my research actually fits the college standard, where I've actually been collaborating, and there are only one or two bits which I could sort of stretch into an account where I've done excellent research and then gone on to achieve policy impact subsequently. Normally, if there's going to be any policy impact, it's in the course of collaborating with the policymakers. So a slightly different model. But I've got one example, which I thought was quite an interesting story anyway, which links back indirectly to David Butler. So I'll start with that. So this is the one example that really sort of fits the ESRC model. So this is an article I wrote, Social Change and the Future of the Left, back in 1987, appeared in the Political Quarterly, with my then research officer, Sarah K. MacDonald. And it was very much a follow-on to How Britain Votes, which I'd recently published with Roger Jowell and John Curtis, who were much better known now than they were then. And Political Quarterly, which you may know, is although it's an entirely respectable publication that you would even submit for the REF, it is really aimed at policymakers. So you have to write in a more accessible way rather than just writing the technocratic details for the academics. And so the argument I made, based on what we'd done in How Britain Votes, which I should add was part funded by the ESRC. And it was really a story about the declining size of the working class. And the argument was that just because of the changing shape of the class structure, that the Labour's natural share of the vote was declining, and we estimated with a bit of simulation that even if they did just as well within their core constituency, then over the 25 years we covered, they'd have lost 5 percentage points. So the argument was really that Labour, in order to get back into power, had to do better to get more votes from their natural constituency than they normally did. although we did point out that this change over time, which of course has continued, and the argument I think was entirely sound, but those sort of social structural changes were much smaller than the fluctuation. And of course, part of the argument of how Britain votes was that it wasn't that Labour had stopped being a class party in 1983, it just was an unsuccessful class party that couldn't even get the working class vote out. So anyway, that was the article which was trying to engage with policymakers. I'm sure it wasn't my idea to submit it to the Political Quarterly. I think it was by invitation, but maybe John or Roger had suggested it. I can't remember. But I take no credit for that. And I didn't do anything about it. Once it was published, I thought, jolly good, got another publication to add to the, it wasn't a very long list at that time. I was quite keen to get more publications. And I then also submitted various ideas at the end of the piece about what Labour could do about this. So alliance with the Liberals and STP, shift to the centre ground, or trying to expand Labour's social base by reversing Tory policies on expanding social housing, which I think they should still be doing. The only way to solve the housing crisis, not that that policy suggestion has met with any favouring government, and encouraging greater union membership. Anyway, I thought no more about it until I bumped into Bill McCarthy down in the Porter's Lodge one day. Bill McCarthy was a Labour peer, a life peer in the House of Lords. People sometimes said that was his day job and college was his sort of secondary interest. And he said, I hear your article made quite a stir in the shadow cabinet, which was the first I'd heard of it. And I'd done nothing whatsoever to bring it to the attention of anybody. But Bill said, well, yeah, made a stir. They were very taken by the arguments. And subsequently, Neil Kinnock introduced his policy review, which shifted Labour towards the centre ground and in a way paved the way for Tony Blair and his much more dramatic abandonment of traditional Labour policies. So possibly it had some impact, although you could ask, was the policy review a good idea? Did it actually improve the welfare and did it benefit the organisation, the nation? Well, I suppose it did in the short run, although Neil didn't win the 92 election, as we all know. But, was the policy review for better or worse? But did I really even make any difference to the likelihood of the policy review? It's just as plausible that Neil Kinnock wanted to have the policy review anyway, and the article gave him a nice technocratic legitimation for what he wanted to do. Maybe I made it easier to get it through the shadow cabinet because there were the facts and figures, so the technocratic side was certainly there. And also, of course, the legitimacy of an Oxford academic, which we shouldn't discount, so that the reputation of this institution, particularly in this kind of field, could also have helped the argument. But so basically, I regard that as, like quite a lot of the things I've done with or for government, if it's what they want to do anyway, they will embrace your argument and your research, and you can do a nice case study for the ref, showing the path to impact. However, it doesn't always work like that. So my next example was Lord Goldsmith's review of citizenship. Now, Peter Goldsmith, as you may remember, was the Attorney General, wasn't he, who gave Tony Blair the advice about the legality of the Iraq War. So we probably shouldn't say too much about Lord Goldsmith. But anyway, as a kind of consolation prize, because I think Blair had ditched him as Attorney General, he was given this job of doing a review of citizenship. And I was invited to join the advisory group, and I wrote a report for him on patterns and trends of national identity. I guess my route into this was a project that I'd done with Alison Park and James Tilley for the ESRC on British identity. I can't remember what we said about a global context, but anyway, that's how we sold it to the ESRC. And so, based on lots of survey research, kind of thing that British Social Attitudes produces every year. And we said there wasn't a crisis of British identity, there wasn't much decline, there's been a bit of a rise of Scottish nationalism, but still dual British and national identities were widespread, nothing to worry about, and in particular, I think the thing that Goldsmith was worried about was ethnic minorities, and what the research showed, what the surveys showed, was that the minorities had high levels of British attachment, highly likely to say that they felt British rather than ethnic minority, or that they had dual identities. So we said, look, there isn't a problem. Now, I'm not actually sure how excellent that research was in hindsight, because I suspect there was quite a lot of social desirability bias in the answers that we got. And in a later project that I did as part of a cross-national team with Frank Kauter, Janne Janssen, and Frank van Tubergen, we were looking at young people, and we looked at their national identities, and we found that young sort of children of migrants or migrants themselves actually had really, in all 4 countries that we looked at, had very low levels of national attachment, although they didn't have strong feelings of ethnic attachment either. They were caught between. So they were neither feeling fully Swedish, German, or Dutch, nor did they feel fully Indian or African or whatever the origin group was. So people caught him, which seems a much more plausible story to tell, and which I think is probably much closer to the truth. So probably our research was a bit flawed because we were taking the survey responses rather uncritically. However, be that as it may, it wasn't what Peter Goldsmith was hoping to hear. And he was very polite, very deferential, and said what a good report it was and how helpful. Completely ignored it. And none of the recommendations, and he went on and did all the things that we were pretty sure he wanted to do right from the beginning. So he made these recommendations for reform citizenship test. It's still a good idea. A new national day, which was much discussed for a time, improved access to English language provision for new arrivals. All, very good ideas. Nothing became of them because Labour lost the 2010 election. And that's actually quite a common story in my experience. You think you're getting somewhere, you think there are going to be some actual policy interventions, the minister gets shuffled to a different post, or there's a change of government, and the last thing the new government wants to do is to enact the recommendations from the previous regime. So, an example, perhaps, of technocratic research, full of numbers, lots of very respectable surveys, failed to provide the hoped for legitimation and was ignored. And probably was sensibly ignored because I think there probably were some issues that, if the recommendations had been implemented, would have been quite sensible. But it did help us, and that's the other big theme, that we were able, when the ESRC did the evaluation of our project, to mention that we'd done all this work for the Lord Goldsmith's review, so we got an outstanding rating. So that's the other main sort of sort of theme of this talk that this kind of policy research is jolly good for the academics who are doing it. Whether it's good for the rest of the country, I'm skeptical about. So, 2 examples. Here's a third one, which is a bit of an outlier, not a total outlier in the things I've done. But again, it was a very, very interesting experience for me personally to go and work in Bosnia and to collaborate with UNDP. So it was a great study to be part of. So UNDP wanted some research on the constitutional position of Bosnia and Herzegovina. You may remember the Dayton Accords if you're old enough like me. But anyway, the Dayton Accords, which Bill Clinton, I think, negotiated, basically partitioned the country and had sort of or if not almost wholly autonomous Muslim, Croatian and Serbian elements. And they had sort of parallel structures. So a classic case of what political scientists call a plural society with these separate pillars. And there's very little cooperation between the Muslims in Bosnia and the Serbs in Republika Srpska. And they wanted to try to integrate the country. Or they wondered whether that's what they should be doing. And my former student, doctoral student Christoph Sam, was very enterprising. He had organized a field force to do research in sort of hard-to-research countries. And so he had managed to get a contract to do this research in Bosnia. And he wanted me on board to give academic legitimacy because they had to have an authoritative expert. So that's how I got involved. So we did the research. Carried out a sample survey, which I thought was and it's based on random walk methods rather than probability survey because that couldn't be done. But it looked very plausible, and our actual travels around Bosnia and talking to people reinforced the impression that we had was that there was still a very deeply divided country. And although everybody agreed with the survey question, asking whether they would like there to be increased political integration of the country, each community's first preference was very markedly for them maintaining their autonomy and the other side doing the compromise. So nobody integrating and giving up some power in this plural structure in order to compromise was nobody's first choice, or hardly anybody's first choice. It was their second choice. Well, Christoph and I disagreed about what we should recommend, but since I was the expert, I interpreted the results and presented them to the international community along the lines that the Dayton Accords were unloved, but that trying to change them risked destabilizing the country and restarting violence. And so I had a remarkable experience where I presented this to not just UNDP, but lots of different international organizations and the different national communities. Actually, I said here, they subsequently decided not to try major reforms. I think they did actually tinker a little bit, and their fingers were burnt, and they realized I was probably right. And so what they did is they then I'd recommend that they develop bottom-up inter-community relationships and try to sort of prepare the ground before trying any top-down interventions. But did I give the right advice? How would we know? Because they're still stuck with the date and the chords, but they're not fighting. Maybe I was right, but maybe that was the opportunity. Maybe it's now also entrenched that we've missed the boat to actually do something about integrating Bosnia. We don't know. I don't think we ever will know. And I think it's very hard to know, really, with this lots of interventions, whether you have given the right advice. At the time, I thought, I'm sure I was giving the right advice. I was terribly sure about the implications of my research at the time. 20 years on, I'm not nearly as confident. But here I think we have a very rare example where the policymakers, in this case UNDP and the international bodies, they don't really have a clear plan. They haven't agreed on a plan, and they genuinely are hoping for some answers. Trouble is, we're not very good at providing definitive answers. All I had is descriptive survey research from which I was making some leaps of faith, basically, or leaps of interpretation. I didn't have nothing remotely approaching a causal analysis, which of course is what the classic model requires, which we don't often have. So 3 examples, one where it's legitimating what the politicians want to do, one where it doesn't legitimate what the politicians want to do, so they try to do what they wanted anyway. But who knows, they might have been right in Goldsmith's case. And then really, people were hoping for answers, but we can't provide definitive answers about what will work in most cases. In most cases, this is a case where we can provide pretty good causal evidence, or as close as you normally get in applied social science. So does affirmative action work? Evidence for the operation of fair employment legislation in Northern Ireland. And I partly mention this because nobody's ever heard of this in the rest of the UK. So I just sort of feel it is a remarkable program, the fair employment legislation, which proves that these things are constitutional. I was always told when I suggested to the government later on that we should do something similar, and say, oh no, the EU law won't allow it, we can't do that under EU law. But we were doing it in Northern Ireland. And we actually had quotas for a time as well, although we didn't research the quotas. There were quotas for recruitment to the Northern Ireland Police Service. But anyway, of course, I had no responsibility for setting up the legislation, although I think Chris McCrodden, a human rights lawyer, probably was involved. But there's some very brave commissioners who made it happen, and actually a lot of help. And I think we've got a lot of the documents, the historical archives, now in the college library, from American. I'm trying to remember having a scene. Anyway, they're in the college library. But there was an American-Irish organisation which lobbied very hard to get the peace process established. Senator Mitchell, wasn't it? Somebody must remember. Yeah. So anyway, we were asked, or Chris McCrodden had been, I think, approached by the ECNI to see if he could do some evaluation of the fair employment legislation. And he asked his colleagues if they knew anybody, and by some rather indirect route, the politics fellow at Lincoln College suggested that I was a good technocrat and would come and do the job for them, which I was very happy to do because it sounded like a very important, worthwhile project. And so we worked very closely with the ECNI, who gave us access to a wonderful database. So this is the administrative data, which is not what I've normally worked on. And again, it's very little known, but they published, and I think they still do publish, every year annual reports of the numbers of Protestants and Catholics in every single establishment in Northern Ireland, above quite a modest size. I did know the number once, but I think it might even be just over 25 employees, both public sector and private sector and third sector. So I talk here about establishments. We don't seem to have a generic term to cover firms and government bodies. Anyway, it's a wonderful database with named companies over a 20-year period, so you can do fixed effects or difference and differences models. And also, there's a remarkable scheme for voluntary agreements, or indeed compulsory, legally enforced agreements between the relevant body and the regulator, the ECNI. And so the ECNI would, when they found that a particular community was underrepresented in a firm, which some were at the start of the Troubles, very extreme underrepresentation of Catholics in some of the major industry, factories, manufacturing establishments which still existed in Northern Ireland. But there are also a few where Catholic-owned enterprises where Protestants were underrepresented. So it was a wonderful scheme because it was even-handed, asking for the underrepresented, for the company to come up with a voluntary scheme which wouldn't involve positive discrimination, but would involve outreach, advertising more effectively, and with the underrepresented community. So voluntary agreements to improve the share of the underrepresented group in their establishment. We had the data charting over time how the underrepresented group had managed. And so we used, I think we used a variety of techniques, but I think the main one would have been difference in differences approach with fixed effect models. I think we also did some propensity score matching. So we tried to compare the change over time in the proportion of the underrepresented group in firms which, or organizations which, where one particular community was underrepresented, and to see whether after they had signed the voluntary agreement, things got better. And to our great pleasure, it must be said, and our relief, we found a significant effect. Not universally, it was more, again, very plausibly, applied better for sort of the medium-sized enterprises than for the very large ones, which were probably already following fairly standardized procedures. And I think part of the mechanism was the use of standardized procedures rather than more informal ones. But the research did show that the voluntary agreements had improved the underrepresentation. And maybe I've missed it. I think oh no, it's another project, which I'll come on to. I don't know whether it had any effect, and I should have asked Evelyn Collins, who I'm currently working with again on another policy intervention. We're actually trying to persuade ONS to change tack on whether to hold a census in 1931. But anyway, that's still all happening, so I not at liberty to discuss that. But anyway, I ought to check, but I don't know. But at least our evidence supported what the ECNI wanted and what I assume Chris McCrudden and the other people who had set up the fair employment legislation wanted to hear. But here I worry, because here we're stepping into academics not as these sort of disinterested, value-free technocrats, but as engaged activists. Suppose we, which is perfectly possible, that our analyses had found that there's no difference, which does happen quite frequently. Supposing we've got the wrong answer, would we have published? Would we have, knowing that that might derail the fair employment legislation? Well, luckily we got the right answer, but I am not convinced that we would have been, would have gone with the wrong answer, or we might have dragged our feet, we might have carried on and tried a different statistical technique. I'm sure with sufficient ingenuity, we could have found a different answer. And there's a great deal of evidence from meta-analyses, particularly of drug trials and so on, of publication bias, that the analyses that show that the drug or that the treatment has the desired effect are more likely to be published than those with the null results. Because with a null result, not as exciting to the journals, not as exciting to the authors, they don't put the effort in. So, who knows? It's all hypothetical, but it's a possibly common example where the engaged researchers have a clear agenda and may not be the value-free technocrats of the theory. This is even more the case with the Department for Work and Pensions Ethnic Minority Advisory Group. How am I doing for time, Colin? Am I still? Oh, I've got 10 minutes. Great. Okay, so yeah, well, I'd had actually a lot of other collaborations I'd done previously with the Cabinet Office, National Employment Panel, and the DWP itself on ethnic inequalities in the labour market. And actually, that earlier one with the DWP on employers and discrimination has remarkably, for a DWP working paper, become one of my most cited publications. I don't quite know how it happened. But again, there are benefits to academics from doing this kind of research. Anyway, I was invited to join EMAG by a rather curious chain of events, not because of my great reputation and the success of my previous work, but because one of my daughter's college friends had gone into the civil service and had been assigned to the secretariat for the EMAG. And she knew that I had been doing this kind of research because my daughter had talked about it and put my name forward. And very often, and you get into these things because of these chains of personal connections and ties, not because of your wonderful, excellent research and your great reputation, or even that of your university. Anyway, I was very happy to be a member of this group. They're a wonderful group. A lot of them have become long-term close friends, like Omar Khan, who was at the time the head of the running, or the sort of acting director. I think he was one who made things happen at the Runnymede Trust, and lots of other people from different ethnic minority communities. But because writing was my day job, as Tundi Banjoko put it one day, I was expected to write the briefs to go in front of the group as a whole. And also I had the experience to handle the civil servants. And I have to say that my experience sometimes led me to sympathise with conservative complaints about civil servants, because there was enormous resistance, particularly from the civil servants involved in government contracting, to our proposals. So there was a house way of doing things, and they really they didn't accept academic evidence. Can I really say that? Well, they didn't accept our academic evidence, and there's very good US evidence that the US federal contractors program works. And so again, lots of similar kinds of fixed effects models to the ones that we use on affirmative action in Northern Ireland, showing that the federal contractors program in the US and the similar one in Canada, they actually do increase representation of blacks and women in the companies who are applying for government contracts. And so we basically were proposing, also following on from Chris McCrudden's legal work on fair employment legislation, we worked up a proposal to introduce something very like the US federal contractors program. And we got quite ahead of steam. The rest of the group were enthusiastic. We had lots of meetings. We had meetings with ministers. And I think for a time Stephen Timms was our minister. The trouble is he got shuffled, and that was one of the problems we always had. But then the change of government, that was the end of that. So it wasn't clear that we were going to get it through Labour anyway, although we were at least talking to ministers about the proposals. Change of government essentially spelled the end of that particular proposal, despite all the wonderful, excellent research, both on Northern Ireland and more particularly the American model, and actually the practical experience of Transport for London, which was already implementing what we were proposing. So we were basically taking what Transport for London were trying to do. Anyway, EMAG didn't give up. He kept on going, and I remember a very memorable meeting with Theresa May and several senior ministers in the cabinet room in Downing Street, where we argued for more action to reduce these ethnic inequalities. Possibly that helped pave the way for the race disparity unit that Theresa May set up, and the website that it still runs, monitoring ethnic disparities. We're not allowed to call them inequalities, they're always disparities. And they show, for example, the stop and search data publicly available on the Cabinet Office website. So I don't think it's made any difference to ethnic inequalities, but at least it is being monitored. And in a sense, all we can really say, all our work on EMAG and the previous work I'd done and the subsequent work I did with Nellie and Valentina, really the most we could ever say is that it means that ethnic inequalities have not dropped completely off the away from public debate, despite the best efforts of that recent government report. So, moral of this story is, however excellent your scientific research, and this is the one area of scientific research where the evidence is strongest, I think, because international evidence, you get nowhere without strong political commitment and continuity among policymakers. Lack of continuity is the biggest problem. So I will now wind up, just say very briefly about what I've been doing in my current research, which Colin's also been helping with. So we've done 2 contracts with the Social Mobility Commission, it should be. Again, I got into it by mistake. It was the Behavioural Insights team in London who spotted the contract and said, oh, why don't we apply for that? And David Kirk encouraged us to apply. So we got a contract. So this was a research, advertised research that the SMC wanted to carry out. So there's a competitive tender, and I have a suspicion that we managed to beat the IFS to get the tender, which I hope is true, because that would be a feather in our cap. The project was to design a new social mobility framework for monitoring social mobility. So here was a case where we had, we weren't really influencing policy directly. They had decided, the SMC or the commissioners had decided that they wanted to have a new social mobility index. They'd stopped the old one for a number of good reasons, so a lot of people would like it revived. And they wanted something a bit more academic that actually measured mobility, unlike their previous index, which measured a lot of things that might possibly be correlated with mobility, but none of it directly measured mobility. So we did what they wanted. And then there was a complete change of the commissioners, so that report never got published. While it was left, they decided to let the new commissioners, every single commissioner was moved off and a completely new set came in. So again, no continuity, but in this case, the secretariat of the SMC persuaded them that what we had done, because we'd finished the contract, was actually worthwhile. So thanks to the secretariat, who now had a head of steam, there was a second contract to actually implement the measurement framework that we had devised. And so that's what we've just finished, and the State of the Nation 2023, People and Places, has now come out. And so in a sense, this might be the one success, because although we're just contract researchers, we did have some marginal impact on the details. And I'm a great believer that the devil is in the detail. So I'm not unhappy about having something that we have avoided some details and got other ones in. So, for example, I think this is probably the first State of the Nation report, but they actually do systematically tests of significance throughout and check whether the changes they're talking about really might have happened. We've also developed a new composite index of mobility opportunities, which I think is more reliable and precise estimates, and it's possible that that may have some future consequences. So this wouldn't fit into the REF or the ESRC. Well, of course, in a sense, the Social Mobility Commission were funding this, not the ESRC. You wouldn't go to the ESRC for funding for this kind of thing. So there was a preconceived plan. That's where you have your most chance of having an impact, but it'll only be with the details, but not to be sneered at. So that's really all. So basically, it's very hard to make much impact. And it's partly because our research is rarely very definitive about what policies should be implemented. Even if you have wonderful causal analyses, like, for example, Raj Chetty and his colleagues have for looking at income mobility. They actually, and we use their work very heavily in designing our framework, but they still don't know. It's another leap to go from the causal ones to explain why some areas have lower mobility chances than others, to coming up with policy recommendations to change things. But it doesn't necessarily follow, because you know the cause, that you know the intervention that will solve the problem. So even the best causal analysis in the world doesn't necessarily give you the hard evidence that governments need. But then the other point is, and perhaps the more crucial point, so first of all, I think we need to be very humble about what advice we give, because we don't know, we do get it wrong. But also, research is always just one of many competing influences within a fluctuating and unstable political environment. Everybody's on the move, they've got their agendas, we've also got our agendas. And also, perhaps, the one thing I'd like the ESRC to think a bit more, that the emphasis all the time is on change, introducing innovations that will make the world better. I'm a great believer in stopping people doing silly things, that's more useful, I think, in many cases, than implementing change. And I think we should do more saying, warning shots, saying this won't work. And the government, really, as with HS2, more warning shots, more challenge, I think is important for government, saying this won't work. And here is the evidence, and actually, in that sense, calling them to account. But anyway, I've had a great time. I've met lots of wonderful people. It's even helped my academic career. It's forced me to do literature reviews on ethnic inequalities, on the economic literature, on social mobility, that I would never have done on my own. So it's actually been good for me, and I think it's good generally for academics to actually get away from the ivory tower and the rather nitpicking, navel contemplating exercises we can sink into, and confront the real world problems that the activists and sometimes government really want to address. So great for us. I'm not sure it's been great for the country as a whole. Thank you.